In December 1944, American POW Ralph Levenberg watched in horror as his captors selected 10 of his fellow prisoners at random. The men were bound, blindfolded, and forced to kneel. He would never forget their screams. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. But it was just one of countless atrocities faced by Allied prisoners in Japanese camps during World War II. The survival rate in these camps was so low that when the war ended, more Americans had died in Japanese captivity than had been killed in combat in the entire Pacific theater. For the men captured after the fall of the Philippines, it began with a march. Not just any march, a nightmare that would become known to history as the Bataan Death March. On April 9, 1942, over 75,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to the Japanese. They believed they would be treated according to international law. They were wrong. The marches also revealed a jarring cultural divide between captors and prisoners. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated from youth to believe surrender was worse than death, viewed their captors with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment. This fundamental disconnect would shape every aspect of the POW experience in the Pacific theater. For those who survived the initial marches, arrival at the camps brought no relief. If anything, it marked the beginning of an even more systematic form of cruelty. As Captain Luis Zamperini limped through the gates of his first camp, a guard whispered something to him in broken English. "Here, you are not a soldier anymore. Here, you are not even a man." The march had stripped away more than just their military status. It had stripped away their humanity. But for the men stumbling through those camp gates, exhausted and broken, this was only the beginning. What awaited them inside would test the very limits of human endurance. For the next 15 men entering Camp Cabanatuan, their first sight would be fellow American prisoners loading bodies onto a cart. 17 of them, all dead from the previous night's dysentery outbreak. A guard casually mentioned that this was a good day. Usually there were more. Camp Cabanatuan wasn't a prison. It was a mathematical equation for extermination. Each prisoner received roughly 300 calories per day, while being forced to perform heavy labor in the tropical heat. The human body burns 2,000 calories daily just to maintain basic functions. The math was simple. Every day, prisoners lost a little more of themselves. The daily ration consisted of a small bowl of rice, often filled with insects, rat droppings, and small stones. Occasionally, there would be a thin soup made from river weeds. The meat in this soup often came from rats the prisoners caught themselves. Some men became so desperate they would eat grass, only to die slowly from the sharp blades lacerating their intestines. Dr. James Miller, a captured army physician, kept secret medical records. Patient after patient displays the same symptoms: extreme emaciation, edema from protein deficiency, night blindness from vitamin A deficiency. We're watching the human body consume itself, one organ at a time. Living spaces were primitive beyond imagination. 200 men would be crammed into barracks designed for 50. The floors were dirt, quickly turning to mud in the constant rain. There were no beds, just wooden platforms where men lay shoulder to shoulder, providing perfect conditions for disease transmission. Disease moved through the camps like wildfire. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and dengue fever were constant companions. But it was the combination of diseases that proved most lethal. A man weakened by beriberi would contract dysentery, then develop tropical ulcers that would grow to exposed bone. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Private Frank Roberts described the nightly ritual. You'd hear men crying out in their sleep, from pain, from fever dreams, from memories of home. But the worst was the silence. When someone who had been moaning all night suddenly went quiet, you knew. By morning, there'd be another empty space on the platform. Work details were designed to break both body and spirit. Men would be forced to carry heavy loads of rock or timber under the blazing sun. Guards would set impossible quotas, then beat or kill prisoners who failed to meet them. The cruelest part. Much of the work was pointless, moving piles of rock from one location to another, then back again. Sergeant James Wheeler recalled a particularly brutal day. They made us build a road. When it was finished, the commander decided he didn't like the location. We had to tear it up and rebuild it 3 feet to the left. 3 men died that day from heat exhaustion. The guard captain just laughed and said we'd do it again tomorrow if he wasn't satisfied. Food became an obsession. Men would spend hours describing meals from home in exacting detail. Some camps had gardens, but most of the produce went to the guards. Prisoners caught stealing food face execution, yet they still tried. The hunger drove them to take impossible risks. The camps operated on their own internal economy. Cigarettes became currency. Men would trade their wedding rings for a few mouthfuls of rice. A hidden chocolate bar could buy a week's worth of protection from work details. Those who still had gold fillings in their teeth faced terrible choices. Every day brought new challenges to survival. Rain meant mud and disease. Dry season meant scorching heat and dehydration. The change of seasons was marked by how men died from pneumonia in the wet, from heat stroke in the dry. Through it all, the guards maintained their brutal routines. But in this environment of calculated deprivation, something remarkable happened. Communities formed. Men shared what little they had, nursed each other through illness, and kept hope alive through small acts of defiance. Yet even these bonds of brotherhood would be tested by what came next. Because the guards had their own ideas about maintaining order, the psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Men who had been captains and majors were reduced to begging for scraps. Professors and engineers found themselves fighting over maggot-infested rice. The Japanese deliberately worked to break down military hierarchy, and with it, the prisoners' sense of identity. Lieutenant Paul Rogers documented the transformation. You could watch it happen. First, a man would stop shaving. Then he'd stop washing. Then he'd stop talking. We called it going under. Once they reached that point, they rarely lasted more than a week. Their bodies were still alive, but inside, they'd already given up. Yet amid this calculated destruction of human dignity, incredible acts of courage emerged. Men would risk severe punishment to sneak food to the sick. Doctors would perform surgeries with sharpened spoons and no anesthesia. Some prisoners maintained secret diaries, recording the daily atrocities in hopes that someday someone would know the truth. The most successful survivors created routines. They would exercise when possible, maintain personal hygiene even with minimal water, and engage in mental activities to keep their minds sharp. Some groups held clandestine classes, teaching each other languages, engineering, or mathematics. Anything to maintain a sense of humanity. Captain William Morrison organized a university in his barracks. We had a physicist teaching relativity theory using charcoal on the floor. A linguist taught Japanese. Knowing the language sometimes meant the difference between life and death. These classes gave us purpose, a reason to wake up besides just surviving another day. But even these small victories came at a terrible price. The Japanese viewed any unauthorized gathering with suspicion. Discovery of these activities often led to collective punishment. Entire barracks would go without food for days. Yet the classes continued, whispered lessons passed between prisoners during work details or in the dark of night. Yet even as prisoners fought to maintain their humanity, the guards seemed determined to strip it away. Their next shift would begin soon, and with it would come a demonstration of power that would remind everyone exactly where they were. The guards at Pacific POW camps weren't just cruel. They were products of a military culture that viewed mercy as weakness. Each guard had endured brutal training themselves, suffering beatings and humiliation from their superiors. Now, they passed this treatment down to those beneath them with methodical precision. Corporal Toshihiro Wakamoto became infamous at Camp Cabanatron. Every morning, he would select a prisoner at random for inspection. These inspections always ended the same way, with the prisoner beaten unconscious for some imagined infraction. Years later, a survivor would recall, "He never seemed angry. He did it like he was completing paperwork." The guards operated on a system of casual sadism. They would force prisoners to hold heavy rocks above their heads for hours. When a man's arms finally gave out, they would beat him for dropping the rock. Then they would make him pick up a heavier one. Training in the Japanese military emphasized absolute obedience through physical punishment. Guards who showed kindness to prisoners were themselves beaten by their superiors. This created a cycle of violence that flowed downward, with POWs at the bottom of the hierarchy. Lieutenant James Morrison documented the guards' behavior. They had different personalities. Some were outright sadistic, others just following orders. The worst were the ones who seemed to feel nothing at all. They could beat a man to death and then go eat their lunch, like they'd just finished sweeping a floor. The language barrier made everything worse. Minor misunderstandings of orders could result in death. Some guards used this confusion deliberately, giving unclear commands just to have an excuse for punishment. Prisoners quickly learned that understanding Japanese didn't guarantee safety. It just meant you knew when the beating was coming. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka stood out for his creative cruelty. He would force sick prisoners to stand at attention in the rain, then beat them when they shivered. He developed a game called a circle, making prisoners run in a circle while guards took turns hitting them with bamboo poles. The last man standing would get an extra rice ball. Sometimes, no one would win. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the guard's unpredictability. A guard who had shown kindness one day might prove lethal the next. Private Robert Hayes recalled, "We had this young guard who used to sneak medicine to the sick barracks. One morning, he caught a prisoner with a smuggled sweet potato. He bayoneted him on the spot. We never understood the shift." Yet even among the guards, there were rare exceptions. A guard nicknamed the Christian would sometimes turn a blind eye to food smuggling. Another would warn prisoners about surprise inspections. These small mercies were rare and dangerous for the guards themselves. One guard caught giving water to a dying prisoner was beaten so severely he never returned to duty. The psychological warfare was constant. Guards would wave food in front of starving prisoners, then throw it in the mud. They would promise medical treatment in exchange for information, then deny care after getting what they wanted. They understood that breaking the spirit was as effective as breaking the body. But the guards themselves served a larger system, one that viewed POWs as expendable labor. As Allied bombing raids intensified, a new horror awaited the prisoners. They would become slave workers for the Japanese war machine. Private Joe Kiyumi scratched another mark on the wall of his barracks. Day 847 of captivity. By all logic, he should have been dead. The Japanese estimated a POW could survive 4 months of hard labor on their rations. Yet here he was, almost 2.5 years later. His secret, a complex web of survival strategies that meant the difference between life and death. The first rule of survival was simple: never be alone. Prisoners formed families of 3 or 4 men. They would share food, watch for signs of illness, and protect each other during work details. If one man was too weak to work, the others would subtly cover his duties. A solo prisoner was a dead prisoner. We had a system, recalled Sergeant David Mills. One man would distract the guard, another would steal food, a third would keep watch. We called it the dance. Every camp had its own version. The men who refused to participate, who tried to go it alone, they rarely lasted a month. Information became as valuable as food. Prisoners created incredible communication networks. Messages were passed through laundry lines, hidden in false-bottomed food bowls, or tapped in code on water pipes. They knew which guards could be bribed, which were likely to conduct surprise inspections, even which areas of the camp were less watched during certain hours. The most successful survivors were often the most creative. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, a former chemistry teacher, figured out how to extract additional vitamins from tree bark. A group of engineers designed secret compartments in their barracks, hiding food and medical supplies. One prisoner even managed to build a crude radio from stolen parts, providing their only link to the outside world. Medical knowledge spread through whispered lessons. "We learned to diagnose beriberi by the way a man's skin dented when pressed," said Dr. James Howard. "We treated tropical ulcers with maggots bred in rotting food. They'd eat the dead flesh and prevent gangrene. It was primitive medicine, but it kept men alive." Mental survival was just as crucial as physical. Prisoners created elaborate memory games, told stories, and even conducted invisible orchestras. They would recreate entire books from memory, with different men responsible for different chapters. Some groups maintained secret calendars and celebrated holidays with imaginary feasts described in exquisite detail. Captain William Porter organized what he called the University of Hunger, clandestine classes taught in whispers during work details. We had men teaching everything from automotive repair to celestial navigation. It kept our minds sharp, gave us hope for a future beyond the wire. Plus, an educated man was more valuable alive than dead to the Japanese. The most dangerous and vital survival tactic was maintaining military discipline. Officers would still issue orders through secret channels. Units kept their structure, even if they couldn't openly display it. This organization allowed them to track debts, document atrocities, and maintain a sense of purpose. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of survival was the moral choices prisoners faced. Men had to decide. Would they steal from fellow prisoners to survive? Would they collaborate with guards for extra food? Would they abandon sick friends to save themselves? These decisions haunted survivors long after liberation. The most successful survivors learned to read their captors. Private George Mills developed what he called the Guard Manual, a detailed mental catalogue of each guard's habits, trigger points, and routines. Guard Tanaka would beat you for not bowing low enough. Guard Saito couldn't stand whistling. Guard Yamamoto was kindest after he received letters from home. This knowledge kept us alive. Some prisoners turned to faith. Secret religious services were held in whispers, with improvised rosaries made from knotted cord. Others found solace in philosophy. A former professor kept a hidden diary written on stolen paper. Epictetus was a slave who became a philosopher. If he could find meaning in bondage, so can we. Our bodies are captive, but our minds remain free. The most heartbreaking survival stories involved sacrifice. Men would volunteer for dangerous work details to spare their weaker comrades. Some would intentionally take beatings to distract guards from sicker prisoners. There were cases of prisoners giving up their meager rations to others, knowing it meant their own death. Captain Robert Hayes documented these sacrifices. Johnson gave his last quinine tablet to Ross, knowing he'd probably die without it. A week later, Johnson was dead from malaria. Ross lived to be liberated. That's the kind of choice we face daily. How do you measure the value of one life against another? Yet, even as prisoners developed increasingly sophisticated survival techniques, they faced a new threat. The Japanese were shipping able-bodied men to mainland Japan. Hell ships, they would be called. And for those selected, all the survival skills in the world couldn't prepare them for what came next. Disease didn't just kill prisoners, it transformed them. Men who had been strong, healthy soldiers became walking skeletons, their bodies twisted by conditions most doctors had only read about in textbooks. But it was Japan's medical experiments that would reveal the darkest depths of human cruelty. Dr. Robert Thompson, a captured Navy physician, kept detailed records on scraps of paper. Patient displays symptoms unlike anything in medical literature. Feet swollen to 3 times the normal size from beriberi, skin splitting open from edema, eyes yellow from liver failure. This is human biology in reverse, watching the body destroy itself. Unit 731, Japan's Biological Warfare Division, viewed Allied POWs as laboratory specimens. At their facility in Manchuria, prisoners became unwilling participants in experiments that defied imagination. They were infected with plague, cholera, and typhus. Some were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia. Others were used to test the limits of human endurance. Frozen, starved, or deprived of sleep until their bodies gave out. The regular camps weren't much better. Tropical ulcers would grow so large you could see the bone beneath. Without antibiotics, doctors resorted to primitive treatments. Lieutenant James Carter described one. We'd breed maggots in rotting rice. The maggots would eat the infected flesh, keeping the wound clean. Men screamed during the process, but it saved limbs, sometimes even lives. Malnutrition created conditions that defied traditional medicine. Men's bodies would swell from beriberi while they starved to death. Scurvy caused old wounds to reopen. Dental problems became lethal. An infected tooth could kill when there were no antibiotics. Prisoner doctors worked miracles with improvised tools. Sharpened spoons became surgical instruments. Stolen alcohol served as antiseptic. The most insidious killer was dysentery. It strips away human dignity, wrote Sergeant William Ross. Men lost control of their bodies. The dehydration was so severe they'd hallucinate. We'd watch them shrink before our eyes, dying in their own filth because we had nothing to treat them with. But the true horror lay in the choices doctors had to make. With limited medicine, who would receive treatment? How do you decide which dying man gets the last quinine tablet? These decisions haunted the medical staff long after liberation. Some never practiced medicine again. As Allied bombing intensified, conditions in the camps deteriorated further. Medical supplies, already scarce, became non-existent. But no one could have predicted the next phase, when the Japanese decided to ship thousands of prisoners to the mainland. The hell ships would make the camps seem merciful by comparison. By mid-1944, Allied bombing raids made Japan desperate for slave labor. Their solution? Pack thousands of POWs into cargo ships bound for the mainland. These became known as the hell ships, and they would claim more American lives than any other phase of captivity. The Maru became the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. Over 1,700 POWs were crammed into a cargo hold designed for 600. The temperature reached 120 degrees. Men went mad from thirst, drinking their own urine to survive. After 5 days, an American submarine, unaware of the human cargo, torpedoed the ship. Only 9 Americans survived. The hold was a scene from Dante's Inferno, recalled survivor Charles Jackson. Men were packed so tightly they couldn't sit down. When someone died, they remained standing, held up by the bodies around them. The stench, human waste, rotting bodies, vomit. It's a smell that never leaves you. Those who remained in the camps faced deteriorating conditions. As Japan's defeat became inevitable, many camp commanders received orders about their prisoners, orders they kept sealed until the final days. Private Robert Hayes discovered one such document after liberation. If Japan is invaded, POWs will be executed rather than freed. Some camps began digging large pits, mass graves for their prisoners. Others forced POWs to build bomb shelters for the guards, while leaving prisoners exposed to Allied bombing. The cruel irony: American B-29s were now killing their own men. But liberation, when it finally came, brought its own challenges. Many prisoners were too weak to eat normal food. Their bodies, adapted to starvation, would reject proper meals. Some died from eating too much too quickly. Others faced psychological barriers, hoarding food, unable to believe the war was really over. The statistics tell a grim story. Of the approximately 27,000 Americans captured by Japan, nearly 40% died in captivity. The British lost 25% of their POWs, the Dutch 33%. By comparison, only 1% of American POWs died in German camps. The final days revealed one last horror. As Allied forces approached, many camps received orders to execute all prisoners. Only the swift end of the war, brought by atomic bombs, prevented this final atrocity. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, some camp commanders chose ritual suicide rather than face capture. But perhaps the most devastating legacy wasn't physical, it was psychological. Survivors struggled with what doctors now recognize as severe PTSD. Many never spoke about their experiences. Others couldn't stop talking about them. The trauma shaped the rest of their lives. The toll of Pacific POW camps extended far beyond the war years. By 1950, over 40% of survivors had died. Their bodies, weakened by years of abuse, simply gave out. Those who lived carried invisible scars. Many struggled with nightmares, substance abuse, and what we now recognize as severe PTSD. Fred Saker, who survived 3.5 years in captivity, wrote in his final memo, "People ask why I can't forget. They don't understand. It's not about forgetting. It's about learning to live with memories that never fade. Every time I see rice, every time I hear bamboo creak in the wind, I'm back there." The legacy of Pacific POW camps changed how we view warfare and human rights. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted some of the worst offenders, but many camp guards and administrators were never brought to justice. Unit 731's leaders received immunity in exchange for their medical data, a controversial decision that haunts medical ethics to this day. Today, with conflicts raging across the globe, the lessons of these camps remain relevant. They stand as a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. As the last survivors pass away, their stories serve as a warning of what happens when we forget our common humanity. If you love military history like I do, subscribe for more content like this.